Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Future Plymouth. The circular economy is our topic of today. My name's Miles Noble, and I'm here to take you through the webinar this afternoon. So what is the circular economy? So basically, the circular economy is an economic system aimed at eliminating waste and the continual use of resources. And we have three great speakers today to discuss this topic. Firstly, we have Richard Harper from Hoare Lea, and he'll discuss how this can be applied to the construction industry. Secondly, we have Professor Katherine Willis from University of Plymouth, who will explain what this might mean for our city. And thirdly, we have Hannah Harris from Plymouth Culture, who will discuss what this means for the creative sector and the Fab City initiative. So a really great programme. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget, we have a Q&A session at the end, so please stick around for that. You have the ability to ask your questions directly to the panel. If you prefer to type your question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom and we'll answer your questions at the end. Also keep a lookout for some interactive polls throughout the programme as well, if you're on the Zoom app. So without any further ado, I will hand you over to Richard Harper from Hoare Lea. Richard.
Thanks so much, Miles. I shall share my screen and start my presentation. Okay, so yes, I'm here today to talk about the circular economy in construction. What does the circular economy mean for construction? Well, if we consider the current way that the world uses raw materials, they tend to be used perhaps once, sometimes more than once if they can be recycled before eventually becoming waste that is disposed of. So how can we ensure that buildings that we create today won't become the waste product in the future? And instead, those buildings could be material banks for buildings of the future. So as Miles alluded to at the start of this webinar, the circular economy is all about continued use of resources and eliminating waste in the area that we're considering. So a linear economy is one where raw materials are used once and then discarded. The recycling economy makes use of those materials multiple times before they might eventually be discarded. The circular economy is all about retaining those materials in as high a value as possible to continue to use those materials as raw materials for ongoing processes and production of buildings or other products, and that should continue in an ongoing and everlasting, ideally, circular system. If we think about some examples of how this works really well in current industry, and not necessarily thinking just about construction, but really the best practice industries that we see as making use of circular principles. So my commute has a large portion of it is on the M5, and one day I was driving behind a DS Smith lorry, and on the back it said supply cycle thinking. And it got me wondering what that really meant. So I Googled it when I got to the office, and they have the ability to produce cardboard packaging, to send that packaging out to their clients, who then package up their products, send it to their customers. In return, they get empty packaging back, which goes back to DS Smith. And that's then reprocessed into brand new cardboard boxes and brand new packaging in as little as 14 days. So the raw material for their processes of producing boxes are the waste products that they also produce in the cardboard that they send out to people. Another fantastic example is British Sugar. So they take sugar beet from the UK into their plant in Norfolk. And from that sugar beet, they produce, that their main end product is sugar. However, they also have several byproducts from the process of creating sugar that they also market and sell as high value products, from topsoil and stones that come in attached to the sugar beet when it comes in off the fields. They produce animal feed, bioethanol. They even produce liquid CO2 for various processes. And part of their emissions of CO2 from their heating plant goes to one of the biggest greenhouses in Europe to provide CO2 to tomato plants. So they've really considered how they can make the best use of all of the waste products of their process of creating sugar. They've got it down to such a fine art that from 6 tons of sugar beet that goes into the factory, they produce 1 ton of sugar, but only 200 grams of waste for every ton of that sugar. So if you think about the sheer quantities of material that are then being used to create high value raw materials for other processes, they've really hit the nail on the head when it comes to implementing those principles of the circular economy. When we come back to the spotlight of the construction industry, so currently 59% and around 120 million tons of waste is produced from construction, demolition and excavation. So the industry has really made great strides in reducing the amount of this waste that goes to landfill by implementing recycling and reuse programs. So only 5% of the waste that's generated goes to landfill on average. But that's still 6 million tons of material that will be buried in the ground. Some of that will be unavoidable due to contamination or hazardous products that can't be processed into anything else. But do we also need to think about where materials that we're using for our new buildings, where those materials will go when our use of that building has finished? Can they be recycled? Can they effectively be reused? How do we make sure that we're reducing the burden on future generations of waste that's going to come from our buildings? One material that we do find more often used in buildings and making up a greater part of buildings these days is glass. And glass is a fantastic material when it comes to the circular economy. We can take glass, and providing we avoid contamination of that material during demolition or deconstruction of a building, that glass can be reused again and again in its completely high quality form to produce high quality glass. However, sometimes glass from the construction industry is contaminated in the process of it being taken from a building, and that glass is then crushed and used to create aggregates for use in road or pavement construction, rather than being recycled or reused as glass. And the circular economy really tries to focus the mind into thinking, how can we maximize the value of this waste material like they have done in the sugar plant? How can we maximize the value of this material that we're getting out of our demolition process, and try to keep it within the construction industry, being used as it was used on our existing building, and retaining its embodied energy and its embodied carbon for as long as possible, to reduce the impact that we might have in the future from creating new materials and new products for use in new buildings. The other thing we can think about when we consider buildings is, what can we do to identify the materials that we've got in a building, how it's been what it's been subjected to in its life, and then also what we can possibly do with that product when we come to refurbish, adapt or demolish the building in the future. So imagine, if you like, a database of materials that says, in this building there are 300 tons of glass, there are 5,000 tons of concrete. And having that access to that information means that when that building comes to a point where it needs to be deconstructed, or if elements of it need to be refurbished and therefore parts of it might come out of the building, then we know what those materials are and we know how they can be a raw material for other buildings or other processes. That then redefines what we might consider as waste into a raw material that can retain its very high value. But how do we do that? So the technology behind Bitcoin blockchain is very much considered to be an incredibly valuable tool when it comes to tracking information and retaining data, massive amounts of data about where something has been, what has happened to it. So when a building is going to be demolished after it's been in use for 50, 60, 100 years, we need to make sure that the information that went into that building in the first place is available for people and can be disseminated to the right people so that they know what materials are within the building and how they can take it down in the best way to keep the value of that material at its very highest level. Another way that we can start in current industry, start to reduce the amount of waste that we're producing on construction sites is through the use of off-site manufacturing. Off-site manufacturing allows controlled construction processes to be undertaken in a factory. And it goes from a waste percentage that could be anywhere from 5 to 10% on site to around 1 to 3% in a factory environment. So for these reasons, designing for manufacturing off-site, the reduced waste that it produces, and often improvements in the program for construction projects can be very advantageous. And that can be applied either to parts of a building or to whole buildings. So it's not just about craning in whole modules that form individual rooms or bathrooms. Building services can also be built in a factory, taken to site and then fitted into place, so that waste of copper pipe, insulation, and other parts of building services can be controlled, and those materials can be used again, either in their raw form or separated into high value materials for recycling. This way, we're reducing the amount of waste that will be produced in a construction environment and helping to keep those materials in the process for as long as possible. There's also obviously not just new buildings that we're always building. We have to also think about existing buildings and how we can reuse them. Now, my experience of Plymouth, Hoare Lea are based at the Royal William Yard, a fantastic example of buildings which have been reused and obviously their value has been maximised in the redevelopment of this fantastic space. It's a great place to have an office, I have to say, and it's also a great place to visit. So that's a great example in Plymouth of how those buildings have been reused. No waste has been produced, none of the buildings were demolished, and as a result, waste being produced from that demolition. So they really have considered how to do their best for the environment and how to make use of the buildings and the resource that's already there. There are other examples in Plymouth where we're going to see that happen. The Civic Centre in Plymouth, I'm sure that everybody is familiar with, has long been discussed how it can be reused. And we'll start to see that taking shape in the next few years. I also wanted to talk today about a great example, unfortunately not in Plymouth, but one where we've really been led by the client to implement the circular economy in the consideration of how the building, what the building offers, how it will be used in the future and how it will operate during its use in the future. So the Brabazon hangars on just off Filton Airfield were built in the 1940s to house one of the biggest, intended to be one of the biggest commercial airliners of its time. The airliner unfortunately didn't do very well. There wasn't any orders taken, but the hangars remain to this day. They've been used for construction of Concorde, and they are currently empty, but been taken on by YTL as a development for an arena project in Bristol. Now, Bristol City Council and South Gloucester Council were very much of the opinion that these hangars have to remain in place. So finding a use for a building that's one of the largest enclosed spaces in Europe of over 1 million cubic feet or 1 million cubic meters, I'm not sure which one it was, has been quite challenging. But an arena has now been through the planning process. And so these hangars will be turned into an arena. The client in this respect has really pushed the sustainability agenda. They want to maximise the impact of what they're going to do or on in terms of sustainability, and therefore minimise its impact on the environment. So by reusing the structure that's in place, we've calculated that there's a saving of approximately 18,500 tonnes of CO2 from reusing this structure and these buildings in place of building new ones. From a sustainability point of view, the materials that will be used to fit out the inside of the buildings and to manage the outside areas will, wherever possible, be locally sourced. There will be 100% reuse of the existing buildings to conserve that heritage asset. As much of the water that's going to be generated on the site through the buildings and other areas will be retained on site and stored. They're also considering how they can retain flexibility of the space in the future. So how can they ensure that this building won't become a future waste product? How do they make sure that it's adaptable for all of their business needs and whilst retaining all of the structure and all of its heritage assets? And they're also thinking about how they operate the building. Arenas, obviously, with large numbers of people coming, could have a significant transport impact. So there's been a lot of discussion around how people will get to, how they will arrive at the arena, where that journey might start and how they will get there from their front door to walking in the doors of the arena. And once they're there, what will happen to waste that's generated on site through the retail outlets that will also operate for food and drinks. So they have a objective to make sure that all of the food retail units use compostable packaging, so there won't be any plastic, and therefore reducing the wastage that would be generated by the use of these buildings. So a really high aspiration to try to keep things within the building, within the site, to reduce the amount of waste that's generated in construction and in operation, and applying those circular economy principles. So coming back to my first image, really, and the plastic bottle obviously has a very poor reputation when it comes to its impact on the environment. But I think we have to consider that actually in a lot of instances, plastic is a very useful and incredibly convenient material. We have to consider how we use that plastic. We have to consider how we can make sure it doesn't pollute the planet, how we make sure that it is recyclable or reusable to the best of its abilities. And we have to apply this not only to obviously plastic bottles, but to everything that we're considering doing in the built environment and with other products and materials that we're using in everyday life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Really interesting presentation. Thank you. Well, we also have a bit of a poll to go with Richard's presentation. And we'd like to know your opinions on this. So our question is, what should be the first priority to deliver a circular economy in construction in Plymouth? So reusing existing buildings, considering deconstruction methods of buildings, creating a supply chain for materials to be reused in construction, reducing material to use in construction of new buildings, or eliminating waste in construction. So choose your answer. I'm sure you have loads of questions for Richard as well, so please send them in using the Q&A button. We've got a few already. Or wait to the end and raise your hand and ask him directly. So I think this is what you would expect, Richard. So 66% saying reusing existing buildings, which is fantastic. And then secondly, creating a supply chain for materials to be reused in construction.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Our next speaker is Katherine Willis from Plymouth University. Over to you, Katherine.
Hi, so I'm speaking, everyone can hear me okay, can they?
Yes, that's all fine.
Okay, great. Not the infamous you're on mute before I start chatting away. So thank you, Richard, for a really interesting and informative sort of overview of the circular economy. I'm going to move into thinking around a sort of slightly broader concept around the circular economy, and perhaps sort of including a wider range of things. Talking about a sort of concept or an agenda called the smart city. And so this is a question really, what might be the way that we might think of Plymouth as a smarter city, and what might the shape of that look like? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what smart city might mean for those of you who haven't come across the term before, introduce some sort of one brief example really of what that might look like in other cities around the world. And then talk a little bit about how that smart city approach might or is currently working in Plymouth. And also, I think something we've talked about with the panel prior is obviously the Plymouth 2030 series is all about sort of generating a discussion about what we want for Plymouth in 2030. So I think quite interested at the end of this this panel to talk about how might we take these things forward, and how might this sort of joined up approach about thinking about changes and sort of future connections in the city be taken forward. So the first thing about smart cities is it's a bit like Fight Club. There is no such thing as smart cities. Smart cities is sort of a term that's used quite generically to talk about sort of innovation and change in the way we think about cities, but and particularly how technology changes cities. But to some extent, there are many different ways you can think about smart cities. So I'm going to particularly look at what I might call sort of social smart cities, so cities that are much more formed around how people inhabit them and looking at the sort of social benefits, rather than it being a sort of technology-led solution. So yeah, often if we look at some of the smart city projects internationally, they can be quite top-down, not very participatory, and quite technologically led. And obviously technology is one of the aspects of it, but what I would like to think about is, if technology is the answer, what's the question? And the question, pretty much we're dealing with is the whys of climate change. We've got inequalities in the city, and also sort of the challenges of connectivity, which we might have seen through COVID, who's connected and who's not. And who's involved, so cities themselves, the spatial space of the city, the people who govern the cities, and also the places in which we live. And there are many different aspects to it. So I'm going to run through now some examples of one example of a smart city, which I think is probably a good example to look at in terms of how it's been delivered in a very community-led and participatory way. So Amsterdam, which has a long sort of track record of working in a participatory way with its citizens and sort of also for innovation. And they've got a whole a series of wide sort of series of activities and initiatives that they're rolling out, from lots of circular economy type initiatives. And particularly one thing they're known for is something called the Smart Citizens Lab, which is a sort of participatory experiment or tool platform across the city that enables everyday people in the street to participate and sort of use technologies for their own benefit. But also there's a transformation of the transport system. They're looking at the way the circular economy is rolled out. They're thinking about pollution levels in the street and how they can change that. And also we looked at the sort of low carbon agenda and how that is part and parcel of thinking around how you make change in the city. So yeah, one I mentioned that I think is a really interesting model for Plymouth to look at is this smart citizen approach, where the idea is that the smart city is not something that's delivered top down by a sort of very institutional level, which has often been seen to fail because infrastructural change is tricky and you need to get buy-in and you need to have people behave. If it's linked around behaviour change, you need people to be brought into that approach. So the smart citizen approach is also about thinking, well, if we need to change our city, we need to bring the residents and the people who inhabit the city along with us. And part of that is sort of involving them in something that's called co-design, which means working with them to develop the change in the city. So I'm going to outline some of the sort of features or the characteristics of what we might think of if we were looking at the idea of a smart city for Plymouth, and also, again, examples of how that's already happening. So we've seen Richard already speak about the circular economy. I think he's talked about it in the sense of the construction industry and the broader aspects, but circular economy can go into again, a very sort of citizen-led approach as well, where people are getting involved with how they use resources as well as how the industrial sector works with it. The citizen governance, so, you know, a key thing about the change at a city level is one of the things that it involves is people participating or acting differently in the city, and that involves how it's governed as well. So one of the key aspects of Smart City is thinking about who's involved, how are they involved, and how does that change the sort of nature of what decision making in the city is. Another aspect is sort of sharing or low carbon infrastructure. It leads a little bit to the circular economy, but how can you think at an infrastructural level how people are getting involved, and this links also to transport, for example. Place-based, participatory and inclusive. So a lot of smart city projects have been very generic, very sort of, it doesn't really matter which city they land on, but it's important that to be successful, they need to actually understand about the characteristics of place and how they fit with the actual place and how they're experienced in the city itself. And then open platforms. So how can we make this the smart city something that is not locked into sort of particular technological solutions and actually is open to everyone to use and is, again, not commercialised? And finally, something I've called collective intelligence, which is a bit of a nod to artificial intelligence, but thinking about how people and AI can work together to think about changes in decision-making practices. So the first thing I'm just going to highlight, I'm just going to talk about in each one, give an example of what it might mean, but also think about how it might also be happening in the city. So we think about the changes in way in which we the city is sort of managed and run, and also how people participate. The sort of key thing about smart cities is that they won't work unless you've got people who are also sort of participating in that smart city. And we've got some really good examples in Plymouth about how we involve people in, for example, the Plymouth Plan. But this can really go down to a much more sort of live decision-making process and a much more ways in which people can sort of see how the city operates and get involved right at the beginning. So I'm going to mention here a project that is led by Plymouth City Council, but we're a partner on, called Green Minds, which is about which is really interesting because it's looking at green space. So it's not technology as such, but it's looking at how we might change the governance model for green space in the city, particularly around the sort of parks. We've got an amazing asset in Plymouth. I think 40% of the area of the city is green space. And actually, how can we engage people differently with that, and how can they become able to participate in the management of that and not just experiencing it? So we've put in a whole. So one of the ways we've been looking at this is putting in a set of technology called Internet of Things, which is basically sensors, and that gives a sort of new way for people to see the way the park is working. We're going to sort of roll this out to the other sites that are part of the city, but starting to involve people in the sort of data gathering and understanding about what happens in the park as a way to involve them in how it's run and how it's looked after in the future. And then sort of from a sort of transport level, we're thinking about sort of low carbon infrastructure and how we can sort of move from a sort of high carbon fossil fuel economy really to a low carbon one. So obviously we've got the Sustainable Earth Institute and their low carbon hub. But transport is one of the key things, moving from a car-based economy to a non-car-based economy. And this is a project, again, led by the City Council, part of the Transforming Cities Fund, creating, so it's a £10 million project to install a series of mobility hubs and also sort of e-bikes and e-car charging points across the city. So I think this will create a really interesting network of really a sort of smart city network of connected hubs, which we can move to e-cars and e-bikes, but also this is a real one where people on the street will start to see a change in the space around them and how they move around. And this links to sort of also energy infrastructure. So thinking about something called smart grid, which is where we've got the sort of electrification of the decarbonisation of the electricity system and how that might work. And to do this, there is this sense, how can we involve people in a way that links to how they live and it's participatory? I mentioned sort of citizen governance, but there's also a piece around, other ways in which we engage with the world around us. And I've just picked up on this project. So I don't know if people have heard of Pollinize. It seems, again, quite abstract to think about bees as a smart city project, but Pollinize are a local startup who've looked at how, again, using data and sort of connected set of beehive information across the city. They're looking at how we can really sort of understand the sort of places around. So they're looking at how you can see how where they source the pollen that they need and how that links to the wildflower resource in the city. And I think it's one of the first projects internationally that sort of looked at how a nature-based solution could also integrate sort of a technological aspects. Important thing is, if we're using technology, is that it's open to everyone and not a closed system. So we're not buying into closed platforms that we can't actually work with in the future, particularly in a city like Plymouth, where, we don't have necessarily the access to large funds to sort of keep funding these things in the future. So I think it's interesting to see, how we might sort of resources open platforms going forward. There is I think I've skipped the page, but we have a project called Data Plymouth, which is all about an open data platform for the city. It's been a little bit underused recently, but it'd be nice to see that really starting to be much more engaged. And I think the final one I'm going to talk about is the circular economy, the second to final one. Hannah's going to mention this in a minute, but this is sort of broadly, I've talked about the sort of Fab City project here. And also as part of the Fab City project, we've got our own sort of digital fabrication laboratory in the university, and also an immersive media lab. So looking at how we can sort of create a resource in the city around digital fabrication and production and automation, and that's something that can be shared between university and the and people, everyday people in the street. So finally, just to sort of sum up, this is thinking about Plymouth as a smart city. I've given you some examples, but Plymouth sits within a sort of regional ecosystem, and actually the smart city extends out. So we can start to think about how some of those things that we might be doing within the city of Plymouth itself extend out into a wider regional ecosystem, or wider regional infrastructure. Again, mobility, smart grid, fab labs. those are all things that we can start to sort of roll out regionally. And Plymouth has a city plan, which is rural and digital as well, which talks about the idea of a digital city. So we have a sort of strategic level. And not forgetting that, again, something that Plymouth has, which is a real uniqueness, we have lots of really important sort of cross-sectoral partnerships we can develop. So one of the ways that you need to think about in delivering the smart city is the links between academia, so myself from the university, but we've got Plymouth College of Art, the City College, industry, government, the city council or the regional councils, and the civic society. You know, we've been working, for example, with a organisation called Nudge, who are doing some really exciting work down in Union Street. So how can we think about this sort of, you know, catalysing these relationships across cross-sectoral, both in the city and regionally? So one of the things we might want to have a look at is a Southwest Infrastructure Partnership that's also looking at the sort of low carbon future in the Southwest and how that works at an infrastructural level. They're currently looking for contributors to join their network. And obviously, we've this lecture series is sort of supported by the Low Carbon Hub at the university, which again is sort of looking at a sort of regional approach to low carbon. So I'm going to finish there. I've sort of introduced in this talk some ideas about, or not ideas, but some sort of components which we might think about in terms of thinking about the smart city. Some of these are already happening, but I think we need to have a much more joined up approach and think about how if we're really going to meet the challenge of Plymouth 2030, that we have to really start adopting these in a much more strategic level and an infrastructural level. So one of the things I've talked about in terms of the panel and from taking out of this, you know, if you're interested in sort of taking some of this forward at a city level in terms of this cross-sectoral, perhaps get in contact with myself or Hannah or Richard, or obviously Sarah from the RIBA, and perhaps we can start to put some sort of working groups together to think about how we might do this in the future. And finally, we've got some really exciting courses at the university if you'd be interested to think about how you take this forward as a future student or get involved with what we're doing at the university level. So I shall finish there and hand back to Miles.
Thanks so much, Katherine, and totally agree with you. I think it's a really good point. It's that how can we create an action plan to really start making more of a difference for our city. So really looking forward to the conversation at the end. And yeah, please get in touch, because that's what this program is all about. It's about getting everyone together from whatever industry you are in or wherever you are in the city, to get great minds together and to talk about how we can really move things forward. So our final speaker is Hannah Harris from Plymouth Culture. So I'll hand it over to you, Hannah.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's working for everyone. Great, so yeah, so thank you very much. What I'm going to speak about, it really follows on from what both Richard and Katherine have spoken about, and we'll introduce us to the sort of Fab City concept, which some of you may be aware of and others won't be. And I guess it follows on from what Katherine is saying, is that it's an initiative, a kind of global initiative, that is one way in which we can take forward some of these ambitions that we have as a city, and in particular that element around smart citizens and engaging people in that decision-making process and driving the change at a grassroots level as well. So Richard touched upon this, you know, the kind of current situation, it's a very linear process that we have, whereby it's kind of product in, trash out, and that uses significant amounts of energy, produces a lot of pollution, and creates waste. And it's a kind of product of our growth, but it's a challenge that we see. And in particular, we see this concentrated within cities. So the view has been for a while now is that 70% of our population will be located within our cities within the next sort of 40 to 50 years. Maybe sooner. It would be interesting to see whether COVID has changed that and people are leaving the cities for different reasons. But fundamentally, it takes the understanding that our problem resides significantly within our cities as a high impact, high consumer of these products, and therefore producer of waste. And so you get this kind of linear situation happening within the city. So the Fab City movement and concept basically decides that we produce locally but connect globally. So back in 2014, the mayor of Barcelona put a challenge to the world and basically said, who will join me in pledging to become a self-sustaining city by 2054? And this is the countdown. This was taken earlier today, so we actually have even less time than is on here, so sorry about that. But it really laid down the gauntlet to say, we need to get serious about this. We need to understand how we as cities take control of this escalating situation, and how we change that linear model so that we can genuinely affect change. And so since the Barcelona pledged in 2014, there are now 34 Fab cities that have joined the Fab City movement and have pledged to attempt to become cities that are self-sustaining by 2054. So as a city, we would produce everything that we consume. And so the concept starts to look at data moving rather than product or materials. So we produce locally, we set a kind of parameter in which we source and make, and then the things that get moved are the data. So the concepts, the ideas, the information, the knowledge to be able to allow then a localized product to happen somewhere else. And the interesting thing about the Fab City is that it allows us to think about local production on a global scale. And I think that's where some things fall down. They work really well in a very small locality, but how do you scale that up? So we're not saying that we stop producing things, we're just saying that we approach it in a different way, and that we create this cycle rather than this linear process. So you'll start to see here kind of data being moved around, data being shared, rather than raw product. And what's really key to that, and this is what Katherine touched upon within the Fab City manifesto, is a real understanding of what it takes to do that. This isn't just sitting at policy level, nor is it just sitting with individuals, but there's a whole methodology around engaging people, working with policy, working globally, having a digital commons approach, which is what the approach that Fab City takes. So that kind of open source principles, so that hierarchy is broken down and knowledge is shared and accessible to people, regardless of their track record or whether they have been involved in any kind of design principles before. And so it works on this kind of full stack model, as they describe it within a city, so that at every level, whether it's grassroots and community, whether it's education, whether it's policy making, strategy development, the entire kind of ecosystem, that at every level, there is some principles to be applied around Fab City that make it possible to operate in that way. And I guess the reason I'm talking about this from the cultural sector is the role that arts and culture have played in actually shaping this global movement. So this started in Fab Lab Barcelona at IAC, which is the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia, and a Fab Lab within that facility. So many of you will be familiar with Fab Labs, but they are spaces where 3D printing, rapid prototyping takes place on a small scale. Usually maximum size is kind of batch production rather than mass production, but they are connected. So Fab Labs have an open data policy, and so things that are made there are then shared and available and can be made in any Fab Lab around the world. And there are, upwards of 500 Fab Labs now around the world. So it's really about triggering people's creativity. So this belief that creativity sits within everyone, whether they think they're a good artist or not, and that actually by giving people access to information, data, and also fabrication and technology resources, however advanced we might think they are, to enable citizens to start to problem solve by designing, by creating, by making, and that is an iterative process, and that is flawed often, but that's also okay. It's an empowerment process by saying these technologies, this knowledge doesn't just sit with the policymakers or the academics or the engineers of this world, but actually by providing access to our citizens, they can start to solve those problems, and they become active makers and problem solvers within this global challenge. And so a couple of case studies where this has worked. Barcelona obviously is the lead in this. And so for them to kind of get to grips with the Fab City concept and move it out of just the Fab Lab and that kind of institution and to a city level, they set up a prototype. And so they looked at a location, an area within the city, and they focused on food, fabrication, energy, and materials. And they just mapped kind of what was already happening and started to make connections between those things, so that all of a sudden, these existing resources and best practice and facilities started to work towards the same agenda. And they could be mapped, and information could be transferred and shared. And they started to build a process in which the citizens became actively involved. So their mayoral system there has allowed and facilitated a process whereby about 70 to 80% of the city's decisions are now made by the citizens. So they've developed a participatory decision-making model as part of this Fab City concept, which is in itself a huge task. It's not just about asking residents their opinion, it's about actively co-designing and co-creating with those residents, and having confidence that with the right skills and access to information, they make really good decisions, and they drive social and economic innovation. And it's been incredible how that has worked within the city, how it's transformed Barcelona's approach to working with citizens, how it's given it global recognition. Something they're really tackling at the moment is how they measure that. They're just kind of busy doing it, but how they document that and how they understand the impact is something they're still getting to grips with, but we're working closely with them to understand the impact. And then other cities that have joined the Fab City movement and the kind of global initiative are all doing it in different ways. So the interesting thing about Fab City is it's not a set of projects that you sign up to. It is a manifesto and a pledge. So each city needs to understand what that means to them, how that would manifest itself, and what the assets are that we have within the city to make that change. So in Japan, city in Japan, they have focused very, very firmly on young people and empowering and inspiring young people to make and produce and problem solve. And they do that in nature, and they do that within labs, and they do that with technology. They do it in all sorts of ways. And they've set up this 3 steps program, which is for me, for you, for others. And it's encouraging that kind of next generation of thinkers and makers and leaders to think about how they use their resources, how they use their creativity to problem solve for the benefit of society and others. In another area, so in Oakland, in USA, they were really aware of their very, very diverse communities, but very disparate communities, and that the city sort of lacked that cohesive soul and energy. And so people were leaving, or there was fear, there was this lack of coordination. So their focus for Fab City was very much around the people, and it's very much around how they can pledge to be part of this solution. And so asking key questions about what interests them in it, what they can contribute, what success looks like, and kind of really building that conversation to drive the agenda forward. And they wanted to do that because they wanted the area to become a place where people wanted to move to relocate to stay and to thrive in. So their Fab City agenda worked alongside their city redevelopment agenda, really, and understanding the diversity of their communities and what they needed to make it an appealing and desirable location for people. And then we have Plymouth, and part of, lots of these aspects have already been discussed today, but part of the reason that we joined the Fab City movement in 2019 was because we believe we are already a Fab City. We have lots of these things already happening in the city, whether it's individual projects like Pollinize or work around data play, or whether it's large-scale programs like the Parks Project, whether it's resources, so you've got the science park, you've got the university, you've got the Fab Lab, we've got projects with the community like Borrow Don't Buy and the Repair Cafe, and then we've got kind of networks that sit above that and integrated with the city around social enterprise and Digital Plymouth and the Real Ideas organisation around social enterprise. So we feel very strongly that we have all of these components within the city, and that the value of something like Fab City is about how we create a kind of umbrella to bring those things together. And very much as Katherine was saying, how do we align those projects and those agendas so that we're genuinely affecting change on a city level and in turn making a global contribution? And what the Fab City does is obviously connect us globally to these other cities and the projects and examples that they are using that we can look at within the city. So we have assets, it's about how we connect them, and it's about how we position Plymouth City's ambitions within these initiatives to make a kind of added value contribution to those. And so, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. This is me, and that's the Fab City link. And I think just to kind of reiterate, that key role of design and creativity in starting the Fab City initiative, but also driving citizens and partners to be able to design and make that change that's necessary.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Hannah. I really love the phrase "for me, for you, for others." The Japan did it. I think it's fantastic. I'm really interested about Barcelona as well. Just a quick poll to go with Hannah's presentation. So what do you guys think? What do you think is the most important factor in Plymouth becoming a sustainable city? Do you think it's global connectivity, engaged communities, policy changes, local facilities, or financial investment? Also as well, so we've come to the end of our programme, but we've got the most exciting bit, we've got a Q&A. So whilst you're doing that, please raise your hand if you have a question you would like to ask directly as well. And whilst the results of the poll are coming in, I just want to say a quick thank you to all our partners. We have so many partners on our website, so please have a look, futureplymouth2030.co.uk. But our lead partners, Plymouth City Council, University of Plymouth, European Union, HMO Government, REBA, Plymouth, Building Plymouth, Constructing Excellence, Shrine to Turgowan, and the Low Carbon Devon Project. Thank you so much. And if you guys would like to get involved in becoming a partner, please contact us on the contact page on our website. We'd love to hear from you. So the results of our poll, 69% engaged communities, and then close second, policy changes. So thanks very much for that. So with our questions, I'm going to invite all the panelists to start the videos. So yes, please raise your hand if you have any questions. We've got, if we start with this one from Nikki Reed, actually. So Hannah, so what is next for Plymouth as a Fab City, and where are we in the process then?
Yeah, so I two things, I guess. One is just putting some framing around what Fab City really means, because it is quite a big concept, and I think we're often used to projects and those being very defined and not a kind of movement and a concept. So we need to just be able to put some material around that so it can be articulated to people that are maybe not as engaged in this agenda at the moment. So we're working on that with partners, which includes the University, Rio, Plymouth College of Art, Plymouth Culture and the Council. And then we're looking at, as Katherine said, like, where's the best place to plug this in? So we've been talking with Plymouth City Council's climate emergency team and the action plan. the potential around the Fab City being really strong within the citizens piece and kind of driving that community engagement. Is that best place where, where we put our energy? Is it around the facilities, so the Fab Labs and the maker spaces? So I think there's more conversation to have to really understand where we as a city sort of frame our Fab City offer and how that plugs into the other things, because it has the potential to be a kind of umbrella, but what we don't want is it to just confuse the messaging as well, because there are lots of strategies, there are lots of action plans, and everyone's doing lots of things. So I think that's the next phase, as Katherine said, a deeper conversation about the action that sits around these now and how we convert them into deliverables.
Thanks, Anna. And please, yes, let's start the conversation. Again, this is what this program is all about. Please get in contact with us on our website or contact one of our speakers direct, and let's really start the process going. It's probably a question for you, Richard. So what role does energy from waste play in a circular economy for Plymouth? And to go with this, with a question for me, and should site waste management plans be made a legal requirement again for construction sites of a certain size? At the moment, cost is only a driver to divert from disposal. What do you think about that?
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I think I'll start with the second one about site waste management plans because it feels a little bit easier. Which I think yes, they should be a legal requirement again for, as you say, for sites over a certain size. In fact, actually, you could apply some part of it to all sites, so that every contractor, whatever size they are, from a one-man band to massive companies, have some responsibility to manage the waste that they're generating on site through the activities that they're taking. Yes, there needs to be a degree of I suppose appropriateness applied to that, in that the bigger companies are going to have more resources available to them to manage waste on their sites, but I don't think we should ignore the amount of waste that is generated in construction activities from normal sort of household, not DIY necessarily, but renovation and refurbishment projects. I mean, I can remember myself having a bit of work done at home, and the size of the skip and what went away and things like that was just tremendous. And you sort of think about the waste that everybody generates, both on an everyday basis and also in those kind of building works. It's quite significant when you add them all up. So yes, I think they should be made a legal requirement again. We do still see them largely on the bigger projects. They're still done. Because if they're doing BREEAM or something like that, then there's a requirement for them to do the site waste management plans from that point of view. With the first question about energy from waste, it's a really difficult one to answer, because it feels that energy from waste plays a part. Is it better than landfill? Again, very difficult to answer. I wouldn't want to put myself in one camp or another, to be honest, when it comes to that one. It certainly feels like they have a place when it comes to managing the quantity of waste that is going to landfill and what we're doing with it, and using it as a useful resource to generate energy and electricity. The energy from waste plants themselves, are they efficient if they're not using the heat? Probably not, and there should be stipulations around that, I think. And what impact do they have on local air quality? I think there's really important questions to answer there as well. And do they actually maximise the amount of waste that's being recycled, or is there a sort of an approach that more of it isn't going to landfill, so we can almost stick in there whatever we want? It's a very difficult one. Like I say, I wouldn't want to put myself in a yes or a no camp on that one, I'm afraid. Sorry.
That's fine. Thanks very much, Richard. This is open to the three speakers. So thanks for Felicity for this one. So what resources do each of the speakers need as priorities to succeed? Katherine, I'll let you start with that one.
That's a nice, interesting, broad question. What resources? I mean, I'm just thinking really, the seminar series has sort of set up this challenge of Plymouth 2030. And that's quite, I mean, I'm sure that's ambitious with a reason, but, we're 9 years away from that. And there's a massive change there are massive changes we need to make. And I mean, I think COVID has really been really interesting because these massive changes that everyone felt were completely impossible, we have just made because we've needed to for the sake of the pandemic. So I think resources I'm not going to talk about it in terms of monetary or skills, but I think the resources we need is if we're going to make a city that looks very different to the one it's now. To some extent, what we need is resources of people who are sort of not committed but are sort of interested in taking that forward. So it shouldn't be led from some sort of top-down initiative. It really does need to come from people and to some extent people upskilling to do that as well, or changing the skill sets or the knowledge that they have. So I think, I come from an education institution. I think part of it is also making sure that we've got the skills that enable us to make those changes for the future as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That COVID has taught us that we can adapt pretty quickly if we need to. And yeah, that's a good point. Richard, Hannah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess similarly, I think it's time that is the biggest resource. We need to dedicate time to coming together and moving this on now from a conversation. And the city is committed, whether that's at local authority level, whether that's an academic level or companies. There are people on here who are in companies who are keen to get involved. So it's really asking ourselves, if we have that much enthusiasm and that much commitment, why is the change not happening? And we need to ask ourselves that as well. And I think often it is time. It is about this feeling or being in addition to people's daytime jobs and roles, and actually how do we start to build this into just what we do and who we are as a city, so that we can all put time into that and making it a reality. I know it's true of the Fab City, there's so much enthusiasm, there are partners, but it's no one's job to do it, and it sort of gets stuck then, and that's that's an awful thing to say, but it's the reality of a lot of these things. So how do we embed them? How does this become a core priority? And then we start to look at how a proportion of all of our resource is committed to making this change. And that, it's just kind of where I fear that it's getting stuck. It's not a lack of will, it's that time capacity to move it on.
Totally agree with Hannah. Richard, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I suppose it's difficult, I think, from a construction point of view. Resource-wise, we've already got everything that we need to be able to make buildings circular, fully circular, to have them so that they can be dismantled and deconstructed as opposed to be demolished. Natural materials, and I saw there is a question about natural materials as well. The use of natural materials in buildings, it can be done. There's 18-story timber buildings in other countries. None of it can't be done. It's just the will and the drive to make it happen. And I think it's I suppose buy-in from developers and clients to understand that there are going to be impacts on program and cost, but it can happen. The circular economy, those principles, they can be applied to construction projects and buildings in general.
Thanks Richard. Thank you, guys. Again, please, we've got lots of questions coming in. Please keep them coming in. Please raise your hand, don't be shy. Matthew, if you'd like to ask your question directly to the panel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi there. It's a question for, well, it's an observation, it's a question for Hannah, really. The Fab City concept, it needs political will, doesn't it? It needs the local government to drive and engage with all the different stakeholders and the community to push forward this initiative. That's my view. So we have an opportunity here, bearing in mind in 2 weeks' time, we have Luke Pollard speaking, and in his role as Shadow Environmental Secretary, I'm sure he would have an opinion, and we should not miss that opportunity to engage him on that issue. But I'm also interested, Hannah, in how do we connect with the hinterland here, our agricultural zone? How do we, in the post-Brexit environment, how do we encourage more and more people to engage with our local agriculture, our local food supply? How does that fit in? And have you had any engagement to date with our local agricultural businesses? And how does permaculture fit in to the Fab City concept? Has that been considered at all? That's my question, observation.
So I think there's 3 questions there. So I'll do my best, but do stop me if I'm missing anything. So the first around political buy-in. So in order to join the Fab City movement, the city has to apply. So you have to make a video, you have to make a pledge and an application. So that came from Plymouth City Council and Tudor in his capacity as leader of the City Council. So we have political buy-in to the extent of pledging and joining, and that it landed at a similar time to the council declaring a climate emergency and building an action plan. So there is synergy there, and I think you're right that it needs political buy-in to now convert it to action. So pledging is one thing. What does that mean in reality? I would question that it needs to be driven from that level, because you will see that the thing around the Fab City is it is as much a grassroots movement as it is a city policy, and it's really important we don't lose that. So I think it's as much about activating our businesses and our communities in the Fab City concept as it is our political structures. In terms of agriculture and permaculture, yeah, so some of the projects that we've been looking at are around kind of city farms and city growing, and there are projects that are working in that capacity, many of which are students of or have come out of the university, and sort of just understanding what that might mean for us as a city. Less so direct engagement with the hinterland and the agricultural sector, but there are some really interesting other Fab cities. So in France, for example, they are the only location not to be a Fab city, they're a Fab region. So they are looking at their whole region as a campus, basically, and how do they not just focus on the city, but they focus on their whole region, some of which is particularly rural. So that's a good example for us to connect with and to think about how they have made that bridge out of just the city concept and into a regional basis, and probably very relevant to us here in the Southwest, looking more at that model as well. So less so, we haven't done anything on that basis, but there's an opportunity to look at some examples that have. I hope that answers the points.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Hannah. To Katherine, really, are we, this question from Ian, are we pitching the climate emergency and solutions to the public in the right way, do you feel?
That's a question to me, is it?
And the whole plan.
Okay, well, I'll have a start. I think there's a question the climate emergency. The question would be, who's the we? Because so I understand that the City Council will have an important stake in this. They lead, and they obviously have signed up. They have declared a climate emergency. Obviously, we have other large organisations in the city. I mentioned, I work at the university. There's a huge agenda around climate change, and the Sustainable Earth Institute are one of the Carbon Devon are sponsors of this programme. So, I think we need to ask: are we waiting for some organisation to tell us how to do it? And if so, probably that's not going to be. If we look at how you create change. It's not necessarily best delivered from one authoritative source to another. Actually, everyone needs to make a change. So I think it's a really important, I think, this seminar series is a really important sort of part of that process, really, and people need to come together from different perspectives to talk about what that means. But yeah, again, the message, the challenge with the message is it may mean different. Climate change can mean different things to different people and how it impacts on their lives. So I think we need to, the key thing with delivering a large programme of change is to make it understandable and relevant to my own life, for example, or to everybody else's life, but also to understand the impact that I have in relation to someone else. So there's a bit of me and me understanding it and relating it to my own, the way I choose to live my life, but also understanding the bigger picture. And I think that's a really, we're not the only city in the world that's struggling with this. It's a big challenge, but Plymouth has lots of very resourceful people and organisations. So I think that hopefully we can find ways to take that forward.
Thanks, Katherine. Question to you, Richard. Are there any current initiatives for reusing materials locally? That's from Darren.
I'm not immediately aware of any. I'm afraid, no.
Thank you. For Hannah, so from Verena, she's working as a small startup company that aligns with supports with these principles. How could she get in touch and become more involved in the Plymouth Fab City initiative to help drive this startup and make a positive change?
Yeah, so please do get in touch, and what we're looking at is developing a sort of Fab City forum so that we can start to have conversations that aren't just at the policy level but are with businesses and individuals that are just interested in that philosophy, and starting to have that space where we can come together. So please do get in touch, and as soon as that next forum happens, we can plug you in.
Maybe post your contact details in the chat, maybe, Hannah.
Sure.
So that'd be great.
Just a note about that question about reusing materials locally. I mean, this isn't construction materials, but Hannah mentioned Borrow Don't Buy, which are a sort of library of things in the city, and I think we're quite fortunate to have a really, really well developed what's called a library. So if anybody's not aware of what a library of things is, it's basically instead of buying something, they hold a whole library of technical equipment. They do have really quite a wide and extensive set of things that you can borrow, from a window washer through to I don't know. Every time I look on there, I think, gosh, there's something else I would not have imagined being borrowable. But that again, Plymouth's quite unique in having something quite so well developed in the city. So you can't. It's not for reuse, but it's not for reuse as in you take it. It's a borrowing, but it's this idea of the circular economy also means just recycling is always going to be more. It's going to be worse than reusing. So reusing is. So yeah, do look up Borrow Don't Buy if it's some part of that question was around equipment or some sort of things that they might want to use as a.
Where are they based, Katherine? Do you know?
Sorry.
Where are they based?
They're based in Think Tank in just around where the city courts are.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant.
But just if you look up Borrow Don't Buy on the internet, you can find them.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that. A question to the panel. What are the trade-offs towards being more sustainable? For example, cost, time, and what's the current status of Plymouth becoming a smart city?
Is that me again? Shall I start? I think, well, it's an interesting one because, again, the smart city at the moment is not a top-down agenda that it's a very set of criteria. It is a set of initiatives that work together. So it's really about linking them up, as Hannah mentioned. I talk through some of the projects that are currently happening. There's a whole range of them across the city. But I also mentioned that smart city is sort of a concept. So it's a question of whether we might describe them as smart or how we want to characterise them. But in terms of some of the sort of innovation or the ways in which digital technologies are being used in the city. I think we're still quite early. There's still quite a lot to be done, and there's still quite a lot of potential there. So this is part of the sort of the interesting part of this discussion is, there's still room to shape what that means for the city, and still room for people to become part of that and understand it and make it right for Plymouth, because Plymouth has its own challenges, and sort of applying something from somewhere else that doesn't work for us would be wrong. And I think finding our own way and doing it in a way that's appropriate to the challenges and the opportunities in the city. For example, Plymouth has an amazing sort of natural resources, where smart city is often seen as quite technological, but actually really thinking about a sort of a green smart city, I think, and in terms of the low carbon, would be a real sort of interesting way in which we can start to take this forward. And at the moment, there aren't really cities that are doing that. So I think starting to, the Fab City agenda, again, what does a Plymouth Fab City really look like? I think there's still some room to really develop that and to sort of show others as well what is possible.
Thanks, Katherine. Bit of an open question to the panel, really, from Chris here. So how realistically can we create this valuable time to take action on this? He's asking, would you support a 4-day working week to free up time, or could local employers, the council or university, give their time to the employees to make meaningful action? For example, 1 day a month to take action in the community.
I really like what's proposed there, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there, that it needs decisive action. It's not just about being supportive anymore, or supporting from the sidelines. It's about understanding what genuine change and new models of working we can apply to address this shared challenge. And so I think some of the things that have been mentioned there about 4-day week or freeing up time is realistically the only way we're going to get to drive that agenda forward, if we make that sort of commitment. And I think it's important, Katherine's mentioned it several times, that that doesn't just sit with the large institutions, that is businesses making that commitment, and community groups or schools or so on and so on. So I think that mix of the people that come together is actually really important as well. And so, yeah, I love those ideas, and I think that's where we need to take the next conversation is, okay, the reality of making that happen.
Anything from the research you did on Barcelona, Hannah? What would you say is the most invaluable thing that they did?
So I guess 2 things is, it was the mayor backed it wholeheartedly, so they did not have to keep making the case for culture and art and creativity to be part of it. It was embedded. And the other thing is, as a mayor, they brought in incredible people into the local authority who were from business, who were from commerce, who were from community projects. So he built this team within what would be the equivalent of local authority, but not from staff that were currently within the local authority. So he literally headhunted world-leading people to drive the agenda, and understood that you needed a broad range of skills in that space. Now, I think we have those people in the city, so I'm not suggesting that we go on a big world headhunting challenge. I think we have them. It's about bringing them together alongside that single agenda. I guess that those are the things. And then they also put 50 Fab Labs in the city. So they physically made it possible that on every street corner you could access a Fab Lab. So they did some really practical things, and they did some really strategic things.
Wow, thanks, Hannah. That's really interesting.
Miles, can I just add
go ahead.
To the previous comments? I think another key thing there, the 4-day week, I think COVID, people's mental well-being and physical health, I think it's seen now, companies are seeing that actually 4-day weeks actually result in a more productive workforce. And if you then have that day where people can then contribute to wider community, city, town initiatives, it's building community. And in terms of the cost and time around sustainability, improved health reduces time off sickness, reduced productivity within businesses, reduced burden on the NHS or other health providers. So it's a win-win all round, I believe. And I think the mind shift change is coming from business leaders. It's already being seen. It's being discussed in companies I know of. So just an
even
observation.
remote working, isn't it, Matthew?
Yeah.
Even so many companies I know just so against remote working, and now I think it's great.
Yep.
And just Miles, just to come in on that, we were obviously speaking as a panel before this, and that was one of the things we said, that if this isn't the time that we can make that happen, then it never will be, because it's proven that all bets are off. That the whole world is in disarray. So actually, let's decide how we move forward. And I think that the other thing is that in Barcelona, in building their kind of crack team, they looked at secondments from the city as well, so that people in really, in roles in academia. So Thomas Diaz, who's the driving force behind this, who worked in the Fab Lab, was seconded part of his time to work with that local authority team. So they pulled from all places, and there was that shared commitment to it.
I was just going to say, I think Hannah's got a really good point about, because I talked about this sort of quadruple helix model where, we look at how we can move sort of knowledge between different sectors and how we can work together. And I think possibly the 4-day week's a good idea, but to free up the other day. But could it be that, the university, there's lots of potential to sort of have these crossover people learning from each other, or bringing new expertise into another area, or learning something new in an area which they currently are. So there might be a model for the volunteering, but there could also be a model of knowledge exchange. I know, for example, in the university we have the Bridge, which is a Cultural Development Fund programme to sort of enable students to work with industry partners, and they've had, hundreds of internships which have been really valuable. But whether we can sort of join those up around a bit more of an agenda, that might be really interesting. And I know at the City Council, they all have their cities of learning, which are the sort of badges they're using to sort of, in a sense, measure those small-scale volunteering tasks as a way to sort of include things that are valuable to you. So.
And Jenny's put in the chat as well, which is a good point. We mustn't undervalue the voluntary sector and retirees, and definitely get them involved as well. That's a really good point.
And Miles, many Fab Labs are sort of staffed by volunteers in a lot of places. So I know Plymouth College of Art, they have a sort of bank of volunteers that are ex-engineers or fabricators or whatever the skill set might be, and they can come in and run workshops, so they can help maintain the machinery, they can drive kind of community engagement, and obviously work on their projects while they're there. So a bit of that has happened, but yeah, totally agree, there's more to be done there.
Have you been, Hannah? Have you been to see them?
Yeah.
Barcelona.
Yeah, I have. I've been really fortunate. I went to their green lab, so that's just like located in the hills overlooking Barcelona, and it's incredible what they do.
Nice. A question to all our panelists. It's quite an interesting one. So if you were to run a campaign on buses and bus stops, for instance, what would your message be?
I want to breathe.
Richard?
Oh, you put me on the spot too quickly.
Oh, sorry, Richard. Hannah, you'll probably have one.
The campaigner in me would probably go for something like "You are the change," because I think part of what stops people is kind of eco-anxiety, like they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So something that sort of encourages empowerment and every small step. So yeah, something like that.
I suppose what the government's using as well for this COVID crisis, we're in this together. I suppose it's, because we are, only all of us can make change. A question for you, Richard. Your hangar at Filton, two questions actually to add to this. The hangar at Filton being maintained and modernised. Peter says this was the first firm that he ever worked for and responsible for its design. How challenging was it to bring it up to the modern day building regulations? And you touched on the natural building materials in construction. How could this help carbon segregation?
So yes, the Filton, the Brabazon hangars, very challenging, I think is the word, and obviously the right systems have had to be put into place to make sure that it isn't incredibly wasteful when it comes to energy. Interestingly, earlier on today, I was actually reading a story about how they used to heat the hangars because they had to be kept at a certain temperature because of the way that, you know, the materials and what they were doing in there in terms of manufacturing the planes and so on. So they've always been heated, but obviously as an arena, they're probably just as likely to be cooled as they are to be heated. Yeah, there's a lot of work that's been done in terms of the systems that will be in place to make sure that they've reduced as much as possible the energy and the carbon that they're emitting during operation. You know, much further beyond building regulations by using things like batteries to cover peak power and putting arrays of solar panels on the roofs and things like that as well to make sure again that they're keeping as much of their sort of energy generated on the site as possible and using it all on the site as much as possible as well. So yeah, very challenging because of the nature of the space. You know, it's something like, I think it's 352 meters long, the building from one end to another, and 35 meters high at its highest point. It's an incredibly, it's a huge building. You just can't get a scale of it until you go and walk into it and you realize how massive it is. And in terms of natural materials, sorry, what was the question about natural materials again?
So do you think the use of natural building materials such as locally grown wood in construction can help with carbon?
Yes, yeah, I think it can. Yes, I think there is definitely a role to play for timber, timber in construction. It has to be in the right way, and the timber obviously has to be managed sustainably as well. And you also always have to consider what's going to happen to that timber at the end of its life. Can it be reused in the same way as a piece of steel might be able to? You know, there might be questions around that. And then what happens to it if it can't be reused? How do we make sure that the carbon that it's locked in stays within that piece of material rather than rotting down and becoming carbon that's released to the atmosphere again? So yeah, there's definitely a challenge around timber, but I think it is, you know, it's such a great material that it definitely does have a place to play, and the fact that it does sequester carbon, and obviously that's what we need to take out of the atmosphere now, is really important.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. Please, if you have any more questions, please raise your hand now or put on our Q&A. Just while I remind you that this webinar is recorded, so if you want to watch back any of the presentations we've had this afternoon, it should be live on our website by the end of the week. It's at the bottom of the programmes page on futureplymouth2030.co.uk, and you'll be able to view all the other webinars we've done as well, so you can have a bit of a binge watch. And Tim's just said to that, to add your question there, the oldest building in the world are made from timber, Richard. I suppose that's a good point.
Yes. What is it? I don't know what it is, but yeah, I would imagine it probably is made from timber.
Thank you so much to our panelists for your time. It's been a fantastic programme today. Thank you so much.
Miles, sorry, I noticed a question in the chat just from Simon. Would it be okay to just answer?
Oh
that?
Yeah, sorry if I missed.
Is that all right?
I
think of course.
Some people have been
I missed that one.
Some people have been typing in the chat and not the Q&A, because I've noticed a couple of other questions in there as well. So
yeah, so I think we touched on most of them, but Simon's is specifically around the kind of economic value and sort of the benefit. And I think there's two points there, Simon. You're right. The economic impact of transporting and therefore the benefit of producing, sourcing, making locally still needs to be made, and that was part of what I referred to with the Barcelona model. Is what they haven't produced yet is a kind of impact report that makes it really easy for a city like Plymouth to take that and say, look, if you implement these steps, this is the impact. So there is still work to be done on that, although the argument is there. I guess the other side of it is something interesting around the Fab City, and there's a couple of cities doing it. There's one in Brazil, and the one specifically that it is eludes me at the moment, but theirs was using Fab City to start new businesses and make new products and services for a kind of new world that we want to live in. So actually their programme around Fab City did generate jobs. It helped businesses to start up, it helped new products to get to market, and when they are, and generally when they sit within the kind of creative and cultural industries, they have higher value productivity, so they're higher paid, they have a higher GVA per FTE. So yes, it isn't just a nice thing to do, there is an economic impact and benefit, but you're right, we need more evidence to kind of just articulate that.
Thanks, Anna. Did you notice any other questions, Katherine? Sorry if I've missed you.
That's right. I have seen there was a question about the donut economics, which is interesting. I know that that's become sort of that model of economics, which sort of recognises the gaps in the economic model that we sort of don't see who are maybe not being economically active but still need to be looked after. I know it's not something I know about in detail, but it's worth looking at. I know Amsterdam's adopted it as a way to think about things, so it might be interesting to look at one of the things maybe we need to look at in terms, like Hannah's just mentioned, to take this forward is put together the sort of economics behind it to make the case, which obviously wouldn't be a standard economic model of profit and loss, but of terms of what the climate change is, the sort of plus minus in there as well, like what's the carbon benefit of it as well. But yeah, I think that might be an interesting next step as well, to think about the economics behind it to create the justification as a sort of backup.
Thanks, Katherine. And yes, let's keep the conversation going. So please contact us for our website and contact any of the panelists, and let's keep the conversation going. So thank you so much to Richard Harper, Katherine Willis and Hannah Harris. And it's just time for me to remind you of our next webinar, which will be on the 10th of February, again at 4 p.m. Guests, biodiversity and carbon. Thank you so much, and we'll see you there.